Welcome to JTV. Agree or disagree, this is the place for you. We're still in the tropics. Yes, the Caribbean. So we're going to have a look at some origins videos, Caribbean Explained videos, history of the Caribbean, destinations of the world, the Leeward Islands, the Great Antilles, the Lesser Antilles, the Caribbean on a whole, the Americas. Yes, people. Yes. I hope you enjoy the journey. Please check out my other videos as well. You've got JTV and you've got JTV2 as well. So we've been covering the Caribbean, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Grenada for starters. So here we go. The Caribbean on a whole.
And DNA. CE. Christopher Columbus famously sailed across the Atlantic and landed in the Americas. He and his men were the first Europeans to wash up in the Bahamas, Hispaniola, Dominican Republic and Haiti, and eastern Cuba. On his return to Spain, the controversial explorer reported that the Caribbean was a land of gold-laden islands. His brother, Bartholomew, later returned to the Americas and identified Hispaniola's land and indigenous people as potentially profitable for the Spanish crown. Bartholomew estimated about 1.1 million people lived on Hispaniola, but modern scholars have generally used the range of 250,000 to a million people. However, the actual Caribbean Aboriginal population is now known based on a new Caribbean DNA study published in the journal Nature, which fuses decades of archaeological work with cutting-edge genetic technology. This breakthrough study shows that the local population before the arrival of the Spanish was much lower and far less heterogeneous than thought. Caribbean DNA study challenges Spanish assumptions. Professor David Reich of the Harvard Medical School led a team of researchers who analyzed the genomes of 263 individuals, representing the largest ever study of ancient human DNA in the Americas. The Caribbean DNA study concluded that the Caribbean had been settled by two major migratory waves of highly mobile people, separated by thousands of years. However, according to an article by the Florida Museum of Natural History, on their way to this conclusion, the researchers developed a new genetic technique for estimating the island's past population size prior to the first Spanish landings. When the first Europeans arrived, the number of people living in the Caribbean was far smaller than the 1.1 million reported by Columbus's brother Bartholomew. Professor of Archaeology William Keegan from the Florida Museum of Natural History was co-senior author of the new study, and he told the New York Times that this study of ancient DNA moves the academic understanding of the Caribbean's history forward dramatically in one fell swoop. Two ancient waves of Caribbean DNA. The new genetic evidence offers insights into the early peopling of the Caribbean and suggests that the island's first inhabitants were a group of stone tool users who had boated to Cuba about 6,000 years ago. These first inhabitants expanded eastward and populated other smaller islands during the region's Archaic Age. The study determined that they had closer genetic links with people from Central and South America compared to the ancient DNA from North American Indian cultures. And further cementing this origin story, artifacts found in Belize and Cuba also suggest they had a Central American origin. The second ancient pathway into the Caribbean was forged 2,500 to 3,000 years ago by groups of migrating farmers. The paper says these people were related to the Arawak speakers of northeast South America, who had paddled the fingers of South America's Orinoco River basin from the interior to coastal Venezuela, then northwards into the Caribbean Sea. After settling on Puerto Rico, these explorers traveled westward, beginning the region's Ceramic Age, which is defined by these farmers' agricultural methods and style of pottery. The new Caribbean DNA study also relied on ceramic evidence. Before this new study was published, there had always been unclarity regarding the various styles of pottery discovered in the Caribbean, each of which was associated with later migration waves. However, the newly gained genetic information finally determines that all the fragments of ancient pottery found in the region were created by one group of people over time. Another aspect of the study analyzed the X chromosomes from 19 pairs of genetic cousins who had all lived on different islands but were separated by several generations. For example, the DNA from a man buried in the Bahamas was matched with another man discovered 600 miles away in the Dominican Republic, according to the paper. Dr. Reich wrote that finding such a high proportion of genetic cousins in a sample of fewer than 100 men is another indicator that the region's total population size was small. The researchers concluded that only about 10,000 to 50,000 people were living on two of the Caribbean's largest islands, Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, shortly before European arrival. Dr. Reich holds back no punches in describing the Spanish landings in the Caribbean, and he called them the beginning of a systematic program of cultural erasure. Furthermore, he reminds us that just because the 1.1 million number given by Bartholomew is in reality closer to tens of thousands, that the cultural erasure is no less significant. True origins. Although archaeologists and anthropologists know that the Caribbean was one of the last parts of the Americas settled by humans, a new study of DNA has revealed when, how, and where the original Caribbean inhabitants came from. The discovery of stone schist graves on the Caribbean island of Saba represented a cultural continuity from the burial practices of rural 17th century British settlers. But now two new papers explain when humans first settled in the Caribbean and how they populated the islands. DNA Mapping, Ancient Caribbean Origins. A new paper studying ancient DNA from the Caribbean, posted on bioRxiv, explains that the Caribbean has one of the most culturally diverse mixes of human beings on the planet. But it was one of the last places in the Americas to be occupied by people between 8,000 and 5,000 years ago. Where these early migrants came from has always been a mystery, until this study of ancient DNA probed into the deep history of the Caribbean, and the story discovered by the researchers is one of migration and cultural mingling, revealing how descendants of the first inhabitants interacted with new waves of migrants who arrived about 2,800 years ago. An archaeologist at the Museum of the Dominican Man and the Technological Institute of Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, who wasn't involved in the study, said traditional models of Caribbean history are greatly influenced by the views of European colonizers who erased the region's complexity and diversity. But the new genetic work shows the Caribbean was potentially always a mosaic of cultures, origins, and ancestries. DNA testing in the shadow of banana trees. The archaeologists wrote in the bioRxiv paper that increasing agriculture and ceramic use represented a move from the Archaic Age to the Ceramic Age about 2,500 years ago, and, aiming to further understand the history of Caribbean people, the researchers studied genome-wide data from 184 individuals predating European contact from the Bahamas, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Curacao, and northwestern Venezuela. The results of this DNA study revealed that a ceramic-using population had originated in northeastern South America, related to modern Arawak-speaking groups, and that they had spread throughout the Caribbean islands at least 1,800 years ago. The scientists writing in Science generated genome-wide data for 93 ancient Caribbean islanders, dating between 3350 to 350 BCE, and evidence was discovered of at least 3 separate dispersals into the region, including 2 early dispersals into the Western Caribbean, one of which is perhaps associated with radiation events in North America. The study also detected genetic differences between the early settlers and a later expansion from South America into the Caribbean, with almost no evidence of admixture. The researchers say their results add to our understanding of the initial peopling of the Caribbean and the movements of Archaic Age peoples in the Americas. Charting the movements of ancient Caribs. According to lead author of the study in Science, Dr. Catherine Nagele, from the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Germany, the team documented high mobility and inter-island connectivity throughout the Ceramic Age, which was reflected in relatives buried 75 kilometers apart in Hispaniola, and they found a low genetic differentiation across many other Caribbean islands. For example, the Bahamian Islands showed a subtle population structure which was distinct from the rest of the Caribbean, and a long-term population continuity was found in southeastern coastal Hispaniola, the island that today includes Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which differentiated this region from the rest of the islands. The researchers also determined that ceramic-associated people groups avoided close kin unions despite limited mate pools, and it is thought that this represents low effective population sizes even on the larger Caribbean islands. What's more, transitions in pottery styles showed no evidence of migration waves of new people from mainland South America, and this finding likely reflects the spread of ideas and people within an interconnected Caribbean world. Hannes Schroeder, an ancient DNA researcher at the University of Copenhagen, reports, "It's rare to see so little genetic mixing between groups once they meet, and we need more individuals from those crucial places in order to really have an idea as to how widespread this genetic mixing was."
History is as richly colored as its geography. From its birth and earliest inhabitants to the arrival of the Europeans, through its stormy battles and struggles, riddled with ancient gods and mysterious peoples, ravaged by pirates and adventurers, missionaries and noblemen. This is a land of colliding cultures and fiery passions. It's the magic of the Caribbean, and it has captivated for centuries. Crystal blue waters, sun-drenched white beaches, emerald mountains rising out of the sea. This is the Caribbean of vacation brochures and travel guides. But there's far more to the region than postcard views. The Caribbean's beauty lies in its diversity. From the tropical rainforest to savanna, from thorny woodlands and cactus scrub to mangrove swamps. It's hard to find in so small an area a greater range of tropical natural beauty. The Caribbean islands form a long, narrow chain, almost 2,500 miles long and up to 160 miles wide, connecting North and South America. Geographically, the islands fall into 3 major groups: the Bahamas, the Greater Antilles, and the Lesser Antilles, including the Leeward and Windward Islands.
There's a growing number of people who believe now that the Caribbean islands actually originated in the Pacific in excess of 150, 160 million years ago. At that point in time, there was no Caribbean. The North America and South America were essentially pushed up against one another. A piece of the Pacific moved into the area between North America and South America, prying the two two continents apart. If you look at the islands going from Cuba to Hispaniola to Puerto Rico to the Virgin Islands and then further on down, you'll notice that they get progressively smaller. And the general thinking is that these are parts of the Caribbean plate that essentially get caught up against the other side, were ripped off in that tension, and left behind. Then you get into the Windward Islands, the Lesser Antilles, essentially east of St. Thomas, and we have primarily volcanic islands, and these are related to the eastern edge of the Caribbean where it pushes against the North Atlantic.
Islands such as Barbados and the Bahamas have coral origins. They're blocks of rock covered by limestone. They include more than 700 small islands, innumerable cays, and hundreds of reefs lying only a few feet below the surface. In the warm, clear waters, over 50 types of hard corals form the foundations of the reefs. Soft corals, such as sea fans, grow on top of them, adding color and variety. On land, plant and animal life is just as diverse. The primary reason is the trade winds.
Wind coming across the ocean, which is obviously picking up moisture. Going up into the higher elevations, up into the mountains, you get into cooler area, and because when it's cool, it tends to make that moisture precipitate. And so you tend to pick up moisture off of the east end of islands and dump it on the west ends, and that's again is a function of the trade winds.
Over 290 kinds of butterflies inhabit the Caribbean. Trinidad and Tobago alone support 400 species of birds.
Wow.
Native plants have been used in bush medicines and herbal remedies for generations, curing anything from toothaches to migraines.
If you have a terrible headache, you know some people have headache, they got a headache here to the front and the headache drop down there, a sinus headache and a malaxary headache. Well, if you have a terrible headache, you get 5 of these leaves and you crush them. When you finish crush them, you heat them over the stove, but don't burn them up. And when it is hot, you tie it on your forehead. And tie one across here for the frontal headache. When these two bush is cool, you renew them with 2 heated bush until you use up all 5 of them. And when you use up the last 5 of them, you come back and tell me where the headache is gone.
The Caribbean natives have always been resourceful, living in harmony with their environment. The most intriguing were the Maya of Mexico and Central America. The ancient Maya created one of the most fascinating civilizations of pre-Columbian America. It rose, flourished, and then vanished deep in the tropical rainforest, leaving nothing but silent ruins. An extremely advanced society, the Maya understood astronomy and positioned their pyramids to indicate the spring and fall equinoxes. Human sacrifice was an important part of their religion, often to appease the god Chacmul. The Maya also played a primitive form of basketball. 2 teams competed on a court, attempting to knock a heavy rubber ball through an elevated stone hoop. The winners received a sacrificial victim, sometimes the opposing team's captain. Mayan culture also influenced other Indians who migrated throughout South America.
The first peopling of the whole American continent, including Canada, North America, and South America, began 20 to 30,000 years ago, and they went through the Bering Strait when it was covered with ice, so they could go by foot and cross the channel at that time, and they then inhabited North America and then South America. So they are related by the religious thoughts and some of the symbols that are found either on petroglyphs done by the Mayans or on their ceramics. Some of the designs, the decorations, the animals that were considered as deities in the Caribbean and by the Mayans in Central America are alike. So they had influences from Central America, from the Mayans. They had the ball game, they had many style of decorations that are really alike with Central America.
On the islands, recorded history begins with the arrival of Columbus. All that we know about the native inhabitation comes from artifacts and the observations of the Europeans, some of which were more fanciful than factual. Arawaks inhabited most of the islands, moving about in canoes big enough to carry 50 people. Columbus marveled at their length. The Indians introduced the explorers to pineapple, tobacco, hammocks, and rubber balls, which the Europeans had never seen before.
when we are excavating, when the archaeologists are digging in the ground, we are creating artificial walls, as you see here, that we call a profile, in which you can see the different layers of deposits made by different Indians at different times. We find also broken pieces of pottery and different artifacts that helps us to identify the way the Indians lived and the kind of material and tools they had to live. The Arawak Indians were agriculturers and they needed stone tools to cut down the big trees before planting their crops. So this is a stone axe that was polished. It's a basaltic stone that is found in the Caribbean, and they polished it by grinding it on another stone like that. And as you can see, it is a shiny, beautiful axe that we found on Saint Martin, and it was stuck with natural glue into a big stick and used like this to cut down the trees before planting the crops.
Only about 200 years before Columbus came, a new group of Indians entered the Caribbean. We call them war-like people because they did indeed conquer the Arawaks. They were the Caribs. They came from South America, by the way, just like the Arawaks. And their culture was based on war waging and domination of other groups.
The Carib society was a male-dominated society in which warfare for the purpose of obtaining captives and booty was considered preeminent. And through the history of the Caribbean, both in the terms of prehistory and colonial history, you have a recurring theme of enslavement and resistance. Certainly, slavery was not introduced by Europeans. There is very clear evidence that Native American cultures engaged in warfare with one another and enslaved each other before the arrival of Columbus.
The Caribs most probably went all over the Caribbean, but they didn't settle. And their most northerly settlement still in the Caribbean is in Dominica.
Because the Caribbean islands lie so close to each other, it was easy for the native people to migrate between them, exploring from island to island. But it would take until the 15th century before the first white man ever set foot in the Caribbean. And even then, it was by accident. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with part 2 of 8 years to secure the backing to make his trip. Several royal committees and monarchs considered his proposal before Spain finally committed. In return for making the voyage, Columbus was supposed to receive 10% of the revenues his trip generated. Spain never delivered. But then again, neither did Columbus. He never found the westerly route to the Indies.
Columbus had a rough chart that described for him a place called Cipangu, which is the contemporary Japan, being some 3,000 leagues to the west of Spain.
A veteran sailor, Columbus knew to head south first to catch the prevailing winds.
He couldn't be sure that when he launched out, backed by what we call the trade winds today, that when he got over there he was going to be able to find a way back.
Columbus set his bearings and direction by dead reckoning. He used a magnetic compass and guessed his speed by watching objects float by.
And by reckoning the distance by time, he was then able to plot his course across the ocean. And what's interesting, of course, is that he, upon desiring to return, doesn't go back this way, doesn't even go back the way that he came, but beats north, goes north, until he finds the winds that he apparently expected to be there.
He first landed in the Bahamas on what is believed to be Watling Island, and there encountered some Lucayan Indians.
Columbus reported them to be gentle, to be unselfish, to be giving. He rewarded all of that by kidnapping them, and eventually, of course, their policies of Spain led to their destruction.
On the second trip, he was commissioned to set up a trading post in Hispaniola. This time, instead of 3 small vessels, he commanded an armada of 17 and founded La Isabela on the northern coast of the Dominican Republic. Situated on swampy, low-lying land, the city was abandoned for better locations, among them Santo Domingo, a city of many firsts, including the first church. Word of his discovery traveled quickly. Other European powers sent their own explorers. In the 4 years following Columbus's discovery, more than 80 voyages were made. Maps and logs from each voyage were not shared, but became national secrets.
The so-called Old World, that is to say Europe and Africa, and the New World, both North and South America as they've come to be called, were linked permanently and in an exchange, both in terms of culture, in terms of biodiversity, flowed both ways.
Almost immediately, the Spanish began to impose their beliefs. Missionaries accompanied Columbus on his second voyage and soon taught the Indians to read, write, and, quote, observe good customs, as well as play musical instruments for church services. But the education and conversion of the Indians came at a cost. Their potential equality in the sight of God was a threat. The Spanish insisted on the natural inferiority of Indians, so they could justify the Indians' enslavement.
There was great debate in, not only among religious circles, but in secular, non-religious circles, about whether Indians were indeed truly human beings. And that debate centered on the issue of whether Indians had souls.
It was said by the Queen of Spain that they should leave the Indians in peace, except the cannibals and the Indians that had not a Christian way of living. So this is why most of the Indians in the West Indies were called cannibals, so that it gave them the right to kill them or to bring them to slavery.
A scenario destined to repeat itself began on a number of islands. First, an expeditionary force explored the island and searched for gold. Any rebellious Indians were enslaved or killed, and a brief gold rush followed. A few years later, with the mines exhausted, the settlers moved on. Hundreds of thousands of Indians died, some from overwork, some from collective suicide.
What really conquered this part of the world was smallpox. You see, the Spaniards brought smallpox to this part of the world. Columbus and et al., Amerigo and all the rest of them. And this part of the world, especially the Amerindians, had no resistance to smallpox at all. They were totally virgin people. And of course, when smallpox hit them, they died like flies.
Islands that had gold became Spanish settlements. Those without gold were raided to supply more Indian slaves. For instance, the Bahamas were completely depopulated.
Well, the Spanish, for the most part, were not interested in agriculture. They were only interested in acquiring or exploiting ready mineral wealth, that is to say, silver and gold. None of the Lesser Antilles from St. Croix to Trinidad had that type of mineral wealth to exploit. There were some silver and gold mines in Puerto Rico, some in Hispaniola, and of course, much more in Central and South America. As a consequence, the Spanish focused their efforts there in those regions where ready mineral wealth could be exploited.
Ultimately, the Caribbean became a way station for riches shipped from the mainland. Settlements on the main trade route were fortified. If you see a Spanish fort, assume this was a stop on the main trade route.
The Pope formally, you could say, gave the Americas to Spain. So once you sailed up to the Caribbean, you first of all already entered Spanish territory, but once you slipped through the islands into the Caribbean Sea, then you were in a Spanish lake, so to say, Spanish inland sea in their eyes. So you had absolutely no rights to be there as a non-Spanish boat.
Spain controlled the Caribbean. To break their monopoly of trade, European adventurers began to attack Spanish shipping. No one did more to hasten the decline of the Spanish Empire than Sir Francis Drake.
The greatest episode in the history of piracy was Drake's overland attack on Cartagena. Drake actually captured the city and sacked it before having to withdraw, having quote-unquote singed the King of Spain's beard. Certainly signaled to other European powers, the French, the Dutch, who were also engaged in piracy and privateering activities, the signal that the Spanish were no longer immune from this sort of attack, even in their strongholds.
For the next 100 years, a rogues gallery of pirates sailed the Spanish Main. The pirate Blackbeard was as eccentric as he was notorious. He braided his beard with colorful ribbons, then accented the look with cords of slow-burning hemp. His favorite drink was a mixture of rum and gunpowder, and he was married to no less than 14 women. Anne Bonny fought with a ferocity that could match any man. she sailed with another woman, and together they became known as the Bloody Sisters. When their ship was attacked, her drunken husband and his men hid below, leaving the women to fight alone. Anne was captured but escaped being hung by pleading she was pregnant. As for her husband, he went to the gallows with Anne's benediction. Had you fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog. During the 1660s and 70s, Port Royal was one of the world's richest and wickedest cities. Located near Kingston, Jamaica, the pirates openly flourished there for 2 decades, attacking Spanish treasure ships that sailed past their coast. Port Royal was destroyed by an earthquake in the late 17th century and slid beneath the sea. Port Royal's most famous citizen, Sir Henry Morgan, plundered ships throughout the Caribbean. But he didn't confine his activities to the high seas. He sacked whole settlements in Cuba, Venezuela, and Panama. The British eventually arrested him, but in a surprising stroke of luck, he gained the favor of the king, was knighted, and returned to Jamaica as lieutenant governor.
Morgan is interesting also in that he used the wealth acquired in his years of piracy to establish a legitimate political base or power structure on the island of Jamaica. And paradoxically, in his later years, actually was in the position to have to prosecute pirates.
While gold put the Caribbean on the map, it was sugar that built the economy. The climate was perfect for growing sugarcane. For the next 250 years, the Caribbean's fortunes rose and fell with the price of sugar. The great sugar plantations were established in the early days of English colonization, the late 1600s. A cheap workforce was needed, and African slaves were imported to meet the demand. When the slave trade finally ended, over 4 million Africans had come to the Caribbean, changing the islands forever. Growers produced 2 products, muscovado, a coarse sugar, and molasses, which was used in the making of rum. The potential profits from successful trading voyages were enormous. Sugar became virtually as good as gold, and the island's economies flourished.
Well, you must remember that in the 17th and 18th century, sugar was a very expensive commodity and a great luxury. And the planters in Jamaica, the sugar planters, made a great deal of money. They didn't make very much sugar. They would make it by the hogshead rather than by the ton. But they made an enormous amount of money nonetheless.
The planters and their wives instead lived a life of luxury, especially in terms of social life, entertainment, glittering dinners and soirees and balls, great houses filled with exquisite mahogany furniture crafted in Europe or in North America. The West Indies were considered so economically valuable because of their produce.
Yes, people. Hope you're enjoying the show so far. Catch you next time with the follow-ons for the series of the Caribbean. JTV, agree or disagree, is the place for you. Big up.
Of sugar, molasses, rum, cotton, tropical hardwoods. That, for example, at the end of the 70 Years' War, France, as the loser of that war, was willing to cede all of French Canada to the British to retain one island in the West Indies. They considered one sugar-producing island in the West Indies to be more valuable than all of French Canada.
The richest colony of them all was France's Haiti.